Kevin Williamson was a small-time actor who then transitioned into screenwriting. While studying at the University of California, Los Angeles, he would start his career by writing a black comedy screenplay called Teaching Miss Tingle. This was purchased by a studio, but would later be shelved. While watching news coverage of the serial killer Danny Rolling, who committed home invasion murders at and around the University of Florida, Williamson was spurred to write a horror screenplay about a similar scenario. It was an 18-page draft about a killer preying on someone at their home and taunting them over the phone. Williamson would expand this into a full-fledged script that he would title Scary Movie. He was inspired by the golden age of slasher horror flicks, movies like Halloween, Prom Night, Friday the 13th, and so on. The script of Scary Movie was eventually bought by the film producers and famous shitstains Bob and Harvey Weinstein for their company Miramax and the subsidiary that they ran, Dimension Films. Dimension would later go on to approach numerous directors to helm Scary Movie. Danny Boyle, Sam Raimi, Robert Rodriguez, and George Romero were all asked. However, Williamson wasn't on board with any of the prior names. He felt, to be blunt, none of them really got the script that he wrote. He felt that they would have made purely a comedy, rather than a true blue horror film with comedic elements. One director that the studio did approach who Williamson was in favor of was one Wes Craven. Wes Craven was interested in Scary Movie from the start and wanted a studio he worked with at the time to buy the script for him to direct. By the time he expressed that interest though, Miramax and Dimension Films had already purchased it. At this stage in his career, Craven was a bona fide horror legend, having helmed The Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, The People Under the Stairs, and most famously of all, A Nightmare on Elm Street. When Craven was eventually approached to direct Scary Movie, despite his past interest in the project, he actually declined the position. It was a twofold reason for him. When he was first approached, Craven was busy at the time due to his attachment to the remake of the 1963 haunted house film, The Haunting. More importantly though, Craven was growing tired of the horror genre at this point of his career. He was fed up with what he saw as meaningless violence and baked-in misogyny and horror on the whole. However, after his work with The Haunting fell through, Craven would reconsider the offer and would then go on to direct Scary Movie. During production, the studio and the duo of Craven and Williamson would butt heads, primarily over two issues. First was the amount of violence in the movie, which the studio really wanted to reduce. Second was the title. They felt that Scary Movie wasn't appropriate enough for the finished film. Instead, they had it changed to Scream.
You're one microscopic cog in his catastrophic plan, designed and directed by his red right hand.
I'll just get my core stance out of the way. The first Scream is a must-watch for anyone even remotely into horror. I'm not saying it's some untouchable masterpiece or anything, but regardless if you end up enjoying it or not, Scream is a touchstone film for the genre that changed and influenced how Western horror would be written going forward. For better and for worse, Scream was the defining piece of Western horror in the 1990s, arguably, and a lot of the more sardonic, wink-at-the-camera style of horror comedy hybrids we still see today owe something to Scream. It doesn't hurt that, at least for my money, Scream is legitimately just a damn good movie. It's the relatively uncommon case of a slasher film where the human cast is the focus instead of the killer, and said human cast is made up of relatively likable, entertaining characters across the board. They're all fairly simple, but believable. Rather than meat being sent out to the slaughter like a lot of sequels to the big slasher franchises, the Scream cast are compelling enough to where you'd rather not see them get iced by the Ghostface killer. The focus on the survivor cast members and their interactions with each other over the masked killer only works here because of how punchy the script is. This is a genuinely funny movie. I can see why Williamson objected to directors who would have made the film lean more heavily into the comedy though. While it is funny, the comedy of Scream 1 comes organically from the characters and their personalities bouncing off of each other, and the actual gravity of the horror is never diminished for the sake of just comedy. For the record, Scream isn't the scariest movie ever made. Not by a long shot. But another benefit it has over other slashers by making the core survivor cast the main focus is how tension can be drawn from seeing affable people in dire situations. Though it is worth mentioning how the movie's famous opening with Drew Barrymore is legitimately a good horror set piece. It's well shot, well paced, and tense from beginning to end, with one of the best wham lines in movies.
Do you have a boyfriend?
No.
You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
This might be the best scene in the entire franchise, honestly. And since we're on about the horror aspects, let's talk about Ghostface. I think there are two things which made Ghostface instantly an icon on the level of Jason or Freddy. First is the voiceover over the phone, which Roger L. Jackson absolutely kills. The delivery can go from casual to sinister at the drop of a hat, and the more intimate method of communication with the victim gives Ghostface a pretty menacing presence that a lot of his competition lacks. The second unique aspect is something decidedly not unique, strangely enough. Ghostface is of average build, average height, messes up a lot during his attacks, and takes some nasty licks from the survivors. At the end of the day, Ghostface is human, just some everyday schmuck in a costume. And while this adds to some of the comedy of the film, the underlying horror is that Ghostface really could be anyone. And for a whodunit mystery like Scream, that's a big asset. Admittedly, the mystery aspect of Scream isn't great. You'll probably pick up on the who in the whodunit fairly easily. The movie does throw plenty of red herrings to make the audience second guess themselves, and one aspect that it does do well is how cleverly constructed Scream's plot actually is. We'll talk more about that in the spoiler section, but as relatively simple as Scream is, there's almost nothing in it which isn't set up beforehand. And if we're still talking about the good general aspects of the movie, the camera work here is actually damn fun. Scream is among the most clean and crisp horror films of its day. Shots are steady, the tracking shots are buttery smooth, and Scream lacks a lot of the shaky cam that other slasher flicks are guilty of. It's nothing groundbreaking or anything, but for a horror, the professionalism with Scream's cinematography is a welcome inclusion. Craven knows how to make a well-shot film, and this style of filmmaking would continue for most of the Scream films that Craven helmed. We're dancing around the spoiler topics at this point, but Scream is a good movie, a damn good movie, and one of my personal favorites. If you haven't seen the film and want to, skip to this part of the video to avoid full spoilers for the first Scream. This next portion is going to be written with the idea in mind that the viewer has seen the film already, so you have been warned. Since we're talking specific details now, here's just a few examples of how everything in Scream is set up beforehand. One of the earliest scenes in the movie is Billy, the protagonist Sydney's boyfriend, and one of the two Ghostface killers in the movie, sneaking into her bedroom and overhearing her dad's travel plans. This allows him and his accomplice to ambush him on the way out of town and set him up as their patsy. In the same scene, we can also see how Sid can block her bedroom door, which comes into play for a chase scene later. For smaller instances, Ghostface can seemingly teleport and appear in multiple places because there's two of them, and a covert camera recording with a 30-second delay sets up a kill involving it later on. The script is tight, and I'm only listing a few instances of a movie filled to the brim with them. But the attention to detail makes the plot of Scream stand above a lot of its slasher contemporaries. Going back to the cast, the core trio of Sid, Gale, and Dewey provide the series with a core cast of returning leads which almost all the movies center around, which gives Scream as a franchise a heart that a lot of horror brands lack. Just in context to Scream 1, however, while all three work within their given roles in the narrative, it's Gale who's probably the most thematically interesting for the movie's larger points, at least to me. For most of the runtime, she's presented as something of a minor antagonist, the out-of-touch and insensitive journalist trope that was popular in movies from the 90s, and in real life today. However, unlike some of the other examples of this stock character type, what makes Gale interesting is how, despite having selfish motivations for her actions, they're all a net positive at the end of the day. The man initially convicted of killing Sydney's mother, Cotton Weary, was in fact innocent. On top of that, if she wasn't so desperate for some kind of lead that she would spy on a house party, the Ghostface killers Billy and Stu honestly might have gotten away with it. Well, at least for a little while longer. It adds a little something to what would have been a fairly basic, unlikable character, but even still, Gale being as callous as she is helps with one of the movie's larger ideas. Gale acts as sort of a stand-in for the news media and how it treats violence and victims of it. And it isn't just her either. News broadcasts splashing trendy murders on prime time, belligerent talking heads looking for sound bites from victims, in this case victims who are still kids, mind you, all essentially milking the tragic situation for all it's worth. A big reoccurring element in Scream is people's apathy towards real violence. On top of the news media aspect, almost everyone in town just seems to treat the Ghostface murders as something to joke about and gawk at, rather than something to actually be concerned with. Tatum scoffs at the idea of some of her classmates' deaths, everyone is rushing to have a horror movie watch party during the town curfew, and people from said party seem legitimately excited when they hear that the school principal has been killed and publicly displayed. There seems to be a disconnect from the well-off inhabitants of Woodsboro and the reality of what's really happening around them, and the serial killings of what are, at the very least, young adults is just entertaining town gossip. That is, until the violence gets real, and the same desensitized people are exposed to it firsthand. When the violence goes from the TV screen to their own lives, the gravity of the situation hits them and they react in kind. I don't quite think it's the movie just saying media bad, people bad, in my opinion at least. It's presented more so that the average person can readily discern between violence as presented in media and violence in their actual lives. And that idea bleeds into the Ghostface reveal and Scream's take-home message. Alright, full stop, I love the killers in Scream. Billy and Stu are some of my personal favorite horror villains. The performances from Skeet Ulrich and Matthew Lillard respectively are great, with both completely chewing the scenery and making the final act. Skeet Ulrich, who plays Billy, is great as this angsty teenager trying to come off as this master criminal, totally going bananas the second anything goes wrong. Let's be real though, it's Matthew Lillard as Stu who completely steals the show, having the time of his life playing an overly excitable goon with some famously ad-libbed lines providing probably the funniest scenes in the movie. As far as the horror parody aspect of Scream goes, how the Ghostfaces compare to your typical slasher villain is probably its best inversion. As mentioned beforehand, Ghostface isn't some hulking beast man, but just some average-sized person. And the one seemingly supernatural ability he did have, appearing and disappearing at will, gets explained away with it being two people in a costume behind most of the attacks. And on their reveal, Billy and Stu aren't shown to be criminal geniuses, like a Hannibal Lecter type or something. Nah, they're shown to be two dumb, mediocre kids with either a petty motive to kill their classmates in Billy's case, or a basically non-existent one in Stu's. And when Sid gets the upper hand on them and they completely fall apart, they just show how immature they really are. Billy throws a complete temper tantrum and Stu starts crying because his parents are going to get mad at him for going on a killing spree. Rather than glamorize the two as wisecracking evil geniuses or total boogeymen, Scream's final act shows Billy and Stu for what they really are. Dumb, immature screw-ups. This works for the comedy of the film, but honestly, that petty, pathetic demeanor of Billy and Stu makes them a little more frightening to me. In real life, serial killers usually aren't these extraordinary supervillain types. More often than not, they're total dipshits, a lot like the two you see here. And even then, Scream isn't saying that media like Halloween and all of its bastard children slasher flicks are bad or glorifying violence or anything. Quite the opposite, actually. Scream 1, more than anything else, is about how real-world violence can't be blamed on movies or the media. It's like Billy himself says at the end.
Don't you blame the movies! Movies don't create psychos! Movies make psychos more creative!
Billy and Stu don't kill people because Silence of the Lambs or Psycho exist. They do it because there were both morally bankrupt shitheads who decided to kill their classmates, essentially for kicks. Media doesn't make monsters as something Scream is basically bashing you over the head with by the end, and even the news media isn't thrown under the bus. After all, it's Gale who plays the biggest role in messing up their plan in the end. And as said earlier, while most of the characters seem fairly callous towards the murders, it's presented more as if they're sheltered and or misguided than actively malicious. When the violence gets real, so do their reactions. The main message of Scream is that media, and violent media specifically like horror flicks, don't make psychos, and the vast majority of people can differentiate between real and media-presented violence. Those who use it as a crutch, pinning their own violence on media, chances are they're complete losers like Billy and Stu passing the buck. Scream is an all-time favorite of mine. It's an entertaining and fairly clever slasher flick, and an interesting enough, if very on-the-nose take on violence in media and its effect on real-world crimes. If you only see one of the 5 movies, the first Scream is definitely the one to go with. Scream wasn't a runaway success at the box office at first, but word of mouth spread quickly and it became quite the hit. With a solid critical reception as well, a sequel was greenlit immediately. Fortunately for Miramax, Kevin Williamson had written outlines for potential sequels to Scream back when he made the original screenplay, and the final Scream 2, which saw both Williamson and Wes Craven return, would work from this outline. The film was set to release a year after the first, which already was a rushed schedule, but production hit an early snag when the final script was leaked online in its entirety. In response, quick and drastic rewrites were made to the screenplay to keep it free from spoilers for the audience. It's interesting to look at Scream 2 in retrospect, because it might honestly be the first film ever altered due to the internet directly impacting production. Even outside of this bizarre bit of modern film history, Scream 2 had a rushed production regardless. It began and finished shooting in about 6 months, and actually hit theaters less than a year after the original Scream did. On top of that, a decent chunk of the script rewrites were done by Craven himself on set during filming. Released fast and messy after the first made waves, how does Scream 2 hold up on a rewatch? Right up front, I feel like Scream 2 falls into a trap a lot of sequels do by just being more of the same. Emphasis on the more there. It repeats a lot of the beats, styles, and themes of the first Scream, but dials it all up to 11. More blood, more victims, more set pieces, more on the nose, just more in general. I want to stress though, that this is not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, not in the slightest actually. Scream 2 is still a highly entertaining, well-constructed slasher flick. It was, however, the start of Scream essentially becoming just another horror franchise, rather than the more subversive movie that started out as. The commentary here is related to sequels, and honestly, it's one of the weakest aspects of Scream 2. There's an extended sequence towards the beginning where characters discuss movie sequels and how, in the words of audience insert Randy, sequels are by their very nature inferior. Not only is that highly debatable, but between this and a line that goes something like, "Who would want a sequel to Woodsboro?" obviously referring to the first movie, it's the start of the franchise's most annoying quirk. Here's a piece of advice from just some layman in the audience, just to the writers. Just because you're self-aware of something that you're doing being bad, cliche, ham-fisted, or whatever else you can label it, doesn't mean you get a free pass to do the thing that you're self-aware of. Pointing out a thing you're doing is bad doesn't make it good, basically. Thankfully, Scream 2 has more going for it than being a sequel about sequels, and being frank, that bit gets dropped fairly quickly. However, what it does have going for it makes it one of the more difficult movies in the series for me to review. A lot of the same things I enjoyed in the first Scream are present in the sequel. For one thing, Scream 2 is still a tightly shot, clean-looking slasher flick. On the topic of visual details, the kills presented here are a lot more gnarly than the first movie too. It's not as gruesome as modern slasher offerings are, and I can't really show you due to spoilers and keeping things relatively clean for this part of the video, but Scream 2 still has some nasty kills and entertaining executions. The big issue though is, it doesn't really bring anything new to the table. Scream 2 is, as I said earlier, more of the same, so a lot of things that I could say are positives about it would just be repeating what I already said for Scream 1. And unfortunately, it doesn't do everything quite as well. One downside between the original and this is that the script just isn't as tight. Scream 1 was admittedly unique among a lot of slasher flicks for how well paced and plotted it was, and I do understand that Scream 2 had to deal with leaks and on-set rewrites, which the first didn't. The production challenges provide a reason, but it's still an issue. The writing and plotting are more on the nose and over the top, and it lacks a lot of the minor attention to detail that Scream 1 had in spades. It's not all bad news on the writing front though, as Scream 2 still keeps the human focus that the first had, and like the first movie, the simple cast of potential suspects is still pretty enjoyable. Except for the boyfriend Derek, but we'll touch briefly on him later. The core trio of Sid, Gale, and Dewey are still fun here, and I like where the characters went this time around. Sid doing her level best to move on from the Ghostface shenanigans and not let it impact her life, Gale finding the success that she wanted in the first movie while having to learn to be less of a jerk this time around, and Dewey remains a lovable punching bag. I actually really like the detail about the nerve damage he received after surviving the first movie. It makes the setting feel a little more grounded than your average horror flick. On the topic of being a horror flick, let's talk about everyone's favorite clumsy killer, Ghostface. Roger L. Jackson doesn't get a lot of time to shine here compared to the first movie, which sucks because, as usual, the voice remains one of the most fun aspects of the character. One thing Scream 2 does add to the table, though, is a more physically imposing Ghostface. This time around, he's straight up just man-powering people, and sometimes just ragdolling them too. And his usual clumsiness this time around comes off more as enthusiasm, as Ghostface just throws his entire body weight at someone. It raises the stakes of the encounter, while also keeping in the sense of humor and vulnerability that made Ghostface such a great villain. Scream 2 also has a lot more set pieces with the guy this time around, with sequences involving a crashed car and soundproofed recording studio being some of the highlights and among the best examples of straight up horror scenes in any of the movies. Overall, Scream 2 is a solid enough slasher film. Well constructed, entertaining, and sometimes decently tense. But it does feel like it's treading the same waters as the first movie a bit too much for my liking. As derivative as it is, Scream 2 is still recommended, and essentially a must-watch for fans of the first movie. There still is a bit more to go over, so if you're looking to avoid spoilers, skip to this timestamp on screen, or just stop watching the video if you've come to your senses and realize there's a lot better things you can do with your time. So Scream 2, like I stressed in the non-spoiler section, really is a more in-your-face version of the first movie, and this includes the themes. Scream 2 really is trying to hammer home the idea that fictional violence and real violence have no causal relationship. No one is innocent then corrupted by some violent movie they've seen or game they've played, and the vast majority of people can tell the difference between fake and real violence. The opening kill scene demonstrates these ideas pretty bluntly and better than any other part in the movie. The world's worst audience is watching the premiere of Stab, the in-universe movie based on Scream 1's events, and they are reveling in the fake violence in the movie. The thing is, once they see that someone is actually hurt and the violence became real, they all immediately shut up and freeze. Because as obnoxious as they all are, they don't enjoy or take some weird pleasure in the real thing happening in front of them. Scream 2 goes even farther than the first movie to make this point by actively mocking the idea of a movie's made me do it defense, with one of the two new Ghostface killers, Mickey. His entire plan this time around was to loosely copy the murders from the first movie and use this kind of movies made me do it defense in the trial for his crimes, getting famous in the process. It's pretty clear that the O.J. Simpson and Menendez brothers trials, which were massive media circuses back in the mid-90s, were very much the inspiration for this. When he gets almost immediately betrayed by the second Ghostface and the clear brains of the operation, Mrs. Loomis, she flat out mocks him for having this as a motive.
Mickey was a good boy, but my God, that whole blame the movies motive. Did you buy that for 1 second? Poor boy was completely out of his mind.
This comes off as Craven and Williamson essentially directly telling this message to the audience. The idea of violent media causing real-life violence is stupid, and you are stupid if you think it. The actress may as well be looking directly into the camera while saying that. Scream 2 does have one directional shift from the first movie though. Out of the two Ghostface killers this time, the real mastermind of the two is Mrs. Loomis, and she's a character directly linked to the Scream series' original story and lore by being the mother of Billy from the first movie. The Friday the 13th comparisons are obvious, I know. Scream 2, in a lot of ways, is the start of Scream becoming a more traditional slasher franchise, with its own lore and world building getting more of the focus from this point onward. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but is a noticeable shift in direction for the franchise that really began here. Regardless, Scream 2 is still a good time and among the better entries in the horror genre during the late 90s. There's just not a lot to talk about here in comparison to the first movie, just because of how similar the first and the second movies are. Would recommend, but know you're going back to familiar stomping grounds. Oh yeah, I almost forgot to explain why Derek sucks. He gave us the cafeteria dance. Yeah, worst character. Moving on. Production for Scream 3 began in early 1999, with Wes Craven already attached to the project. Kevin Williamson was approached to return, but due to contractual obligations elsewhere, he was only able to provide a proposed draft for a third Scream. The screenwriter for this one was Aaron Kruger, who primarily just took the job for a chance to work with Craven. While uncredited for his contributions, Craven himself acted as a co-writer to help with the inexperienced Kruger get a grasp on the characters. Production was slated to go, but a certain event changed everything. On April 20th, 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold failed to blow up their high school and proceeded to open fire on those inside. 12 students and 1 teacher were murdered, and 21 others were injured in the assault. This, along with other prior murders that were alleged to have been inspired by Scream, led the studio to get cold feet on the current direction of the film. They proposed new rules for the movie. For starters, no school or small town setting to avoid any sort of Columbine comparison. Next, they wanted Craven to dial up the comedy while heavily toning down the violence. The original ask was to make the film completely bloodless, and Craven apparently had to fight with the higher-ups to get even the toned down and sanitized Scream 3 we got. All of this, paired with another onslaught of on-set rewrites, scheduling issues with Neve Campbell they had to film around, and an early 2000 release date just around the corner, Scream 3 sounds like it had the worst production of the entire series. So, against all odds, is Scream 3 a solid enough follow-up to the prior films? The short answer is no, unfortunately. The censorship of Scream 3 is both immediately apparent and immediately an issue. The horror sequences in the movie lack a lot of punch with how reduced the violence is. Ghostface in 3 is probably the single most overpowered version of the character in the franchise, an issue we'll touch on later, but he never feels like a real threat due to how he's actually presented. And with how over the top the gags are, and how much lighter the tone is this time around, Scream 3 begins to feel like a parody of Scream itself more than the third entry in the series. The first 2 Scream movies are comedic, sure, but 3 goes way too far. Even during the horror scenes, the movie can't help but make light of the situation, which takes all the tension out of the scene at once. The chase in the prop room and the house explosion set pieces are the worst offenders, and the bigger scope of Scream 3 takes away from the more intimate whodunit horror vibe the series thrives on. I really hope you enjoy the loud musical sting for false jump scares too, by the way. All the movies had that issue to some degree, but Scream 3 really loves that trick. This was all a direct result of the film's hellish production, and another issue with Scream 3 that you could probably chalk up to that as well is how unfocused the movie is. The initial setup is based around the production of a sequel to Stab, the in-universe film adaptation of Scream's events. On set, actors in the movie are being murdered in real life by the new Ghostface killer in the order that they die in the film's script. The catch? There are multiple versions of the film script, and no one knows which one the killer is referencing. For the record, I actually really enjoy this idea, but Scream 3 brings it up and very shortly afterward drops it in favor of its numerous other unfocused plot threads. On top of that, I'm really not a fan of what they do with the core 3 characters this time. Sid almost feels like a non-entity in the plot for most of it, which again unfortunately does make sense with the scheduling issues the movie ran into. However, what they do end up doing with her character here feels like regression from Scream 2. I'm not necessarily against the idea of her living isolated and hidden from basically everyone but her dad and Dewey, and I do think it makes sense for her to go into women's crisis work after the events of the first two movies. That much is fine. The real issue for me is how it portrays her as this easily frightened waif, so horribly traumatized by her mother's death and the idea of Ghostface that she has vivid nightmares of both and can be easily manipulated by someone mimicking her mom's voice. Considering Scream 2 opened with Sid so clearly beyond all this Ghostface bullshit, something that Scream 4 and even 5 continue, Scream 3's portrayal of Sid feels like it might have worked in between 1 and 2, but not as the conclusion of that story. Dewey and Gale don't fare much better, as they're just repeating the exact same arc they had in Scream 2. Gale got too big for her britches and has to come back down to earth, and Dewey is sour at Gale covering murders and has to eventually prove himself as being more than just bumbling comic relief. They fight, bicker, then get together in the end because opposites attract or something. Considering both are essentially co-protagonists this time around, with Sid mostly on the sidelines, you could have really explored their actual relationship dynamic after they shacked up in Scream 2, but Scream 3 was content with spinning its wheels in this regard. Even Ghostface isn't free from this mischaracterization. Roger L. Jackson really doesn't get a lot to do this time around because Ghostface's gimmick this time is having a super voice box that can imitate anyone's voice. This essentially takes away one of his most iconic features. And with this impossible sci-fi voice changer and his superhuman durability that he shows throughout the movie, Ghostface loses that human vulnerability which made the character stand out from the rest of the slasher rogues gallery. It really feels like Scream 3 is just embracing traditional slasher tropes and cliches at this point, which the series used to make fun of. We'll touch on this more later, though. And I guess we do have to talk about the comedy, since, after all, more than anything else, Scream 3 is a comedy, but it is one of those things that's hard to quantify in a review. Comedy is extremely subjective, and what I might laugh out loud at, you might think is the dumbest thing ever, and vice versa. However, I will say Scream 3's humor, if I had to give my opinion, is nothing short of a mixed bag. In the movie's defense, there are moments that did get a laugh out of me, especially some of the drier stuff earlier on in the film.
Is that a threat, Detective? When it's a threat, you'll know it. Was that a threat?
But I'll be honest, when I made the complaint in the Scream 2 portion of this video about how you can't just say something is bad and do it anyway, that's cop-out, Scream 3 is the most guilty of that in the entire franchise. Minor spoilers, but it's what I meant when I said that the exploding house set piece was one of the worst offenders in the entire movie. Because the entire joke of it is people so desperate to read about what's going to happen in the script that the killer is somehow printing live outside of a fax machine. The gag is like they're so desperate to not be killed, but they're like, I have to see if I'm going to die in the script, and going back inside obviously will get them killed. And this wouldn't be the worst if it was one and done, a quick gag, but the movie is constantly just nudging you in the ribs during this sequence, and it overstays its welcome. That's definitely the worst individual example in the movie, but that kind of spirit to the humor just keeps cropping up, especially with the new Gale Weathers actor character who becomes sort of like a sidekick. At the end of the day though, even understanding how hellish the film's production was, Scream 3 is honestly just bad. Its humor is in your face this time, overshadowing the horror in this alleged horror movie while not really being all that funny like we went over. The script is unfocused, the character writing is off or treading familiar ground, and as such, it lacks the clever writing and attention to detail as the first Scream, and even to a lesser degree Scream 2. This was one of the more disappointing ones to revisit, and in my opinion, this is the worst Scream movie. There are a few more things I'd like to go over, but that's again dipping into spoiler territory. If you want to watch the movie yourself and form your own opinion, rather than listening to some hack YouTube man shit all over it, skip to this part of the video. As we briefly touched on earlier, Scream 3 is embracing slasher tropes and playing them straight this time around. Sid is haunted by her ghost mom in a similar way to Jason Voorhees and his mom from Friday the 13th, and the new Ghostface, Roman, is revealed to be Sid's bastard half-brother. Yeah, Scream 3 is basically stealing the Michael Myers and Laurie Strode relationship from Halloween 2, something John Carpenter himself has openly regretted writing in the movie. Trying to pass off as horror satire while reworking plot details from some of the most famous examples of the genre, while playing them completely straight at the same time, just rubs me the wrong way. On that note, the new Ghostface Roman is the worst. On top of the outright superhuman things he does, which we already went over, Roman being retconned into being Sid's brother and the true mastermind behind the events of Scream 1 is just so damn contrived. Not only does it make the first Scream significantly less interesting with this in mind, the idea of having all of this dropped on the audience in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the movie, with it all boiling down to a brand new character showing up and going,
It's me, Austin! Oh, son of a bitch! What? It's me, Austin! It was me all along, Austin!
has never worked to my knowledge. And on the same note of expanding on things from the non-spoiler section, the unfocused script introduced another major plot thread where nothing much ended up being done with it. Had they committed to it, however, it easily would have been one of the darker avenues Scream would have ever touched on. Scream 3 focuses more on the backstory of Sid's mom more than any of the other three movies, and this entry details her brief stint as an actress in Hollywood. A major producer who primarily backs horror movies named Milton worked with Sid's mom briefly, and invited her to one of his after-shoot parties. You see, Milton is also a massive sex pest who assaults women he works with at these parties. One of these women happened to be Sid's mom, who became pregnant with— wait. Movie producer primarily backing horror sex pest? Fuck the lore. Who produced Scream again? As mentioned during the making of portion, the Scream series was funded and distributed by Miramax, specifically a label within it called Dimension Films, which was headed by Bob and Harvey Weinstein. If you're familiar with those names, you see where this is going. In October 2017, the New York Times came out with a report which featured dozens of women accusing Harvey Weinstein of sexual assault and full-on rape. He was arrested in May 2018 and convicted of rape in the third degree. The thing is, Weinstein's behavior was essentially an open secret in the business for years beforehand, with public jokes about him being a prolific sex pest going back to the late 1990s at least. In fact, one of Weinstein's accusers was Rose McGowan, an actress who appeared in the first Scream and was allegedly assaulted in 1997 by Weinstein in a hotel room during the Sundance Film Festival. Keep in mind, both Scream 2 and 3 would have been in production after this, with the Weinsteins attached to both. I think it's a hell of a coincidence if Craven wasn't at least aware of word of mouth surrounding Harvey Weinstein at the time, and didn't at least partially reference him with the Milton character. Thing is, even with this very real, very uncomfortable link, I'd still criticize Scream 3 for using this plot element the way it did. This could have been a real exploration of the abuse going on behind the scenes in major studio filmmaking, and Scream going from poking fun at movies to satirizing the movie industry would have been a very natural evolution. Instead, Scream 3 uses sexual abuse from guys in power as essentially just a springboard for the main villain's backstory. You know, I'm not much of a big thinker, and this might be getting dangerously close to approaching a topic far beyond a stupid YouTube review like this, but it seems a bit messed up that a woman's rape is used as fuel for another man's motive, almost in passing. I can understand why Craven couldn't go too far in this direction, and I'm getting dangerously close to reviewing what a movie isn't rather than reviewing what a movie is. It's just that on top of every other issue we've gone over with Scream 3, this kind of missed potential and subject matter misuse is just the final nail in the coffin. Scream 3 is a lackluster sequel and just a bad movie on its own. It would be 11 years between the release of Scream 3 and 4, and honestly, there isn't a lot of behind-the-scenes information on it. Both Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson returned as director and writer respectively. Unlike the total disaster of Scream 3's production, Scream 4 really only had two major hiccups. A lawsuit from a producer from the trilogy, Kathy Conrad, against the Weinstein Company had to be settled out of court, and there are rumors that the original ending written by Williamson was rewritten, which he didn't approve of. Aaron Kruger and Paul Harris Boardman were brought on for rewrites, but Craven stated that they were kept to an absolute minimum and the final screenplay is still primarily Williamson's. And honestly, that's it. Scream 4 had an unusually smooth production, so will this lead to a better Scream sequel? Let's get into it. Alright, so I have to start with probably my biggest issue with Scream 4 up front. The movie's technical aspects range from jarring to straight up bad. There are little things here and there, like how much the movie overuses the loud musical sting for fake jump scares, but those are mostly nitpicks. Not the real issue here, and the most apparent one in this regard, is the camera work, and the extremely odd visual filter effect going on specifically. As we went over while talking about the first three movies, one of the defining visual traits of Scream and Craven's work overall was how clean they're shot. Steady, stable camera work with smooth tracking shots for movement. The three prior movies had it all, but Scream 4 is a lot more mixed in that regard. Close-up shaky cam isn't uncommon here, as well as sharp cuts in succession, which can be rather jarring to watch. I do understand that this was the style at the time for horror flicks, and Scream 4 is hardly the worst offender for this, but it's still not ideal. What I would argue is just straight up bad is the obnoxious bloom that saturates the entire movie. Full stop, it might be the worst use of bloom that I have ever seen. Seriously, it looks like a nuclear bomb is going off in the background of a lot of these scenes, and it never stopped distracting me. There's the occasional good shot thanks to the bloom effect, but they're few and far between, and the movie suffers with this obnoxious visual filter. On a more positive note, Scream 4 had a pretty shockingly tight script, and outside of a few questionable aspects, is a pretty good story told alright. Like the first two good prior Scream movies, you can pay attention to a lot of the clues and foreshadowing which builds up to the eventual unmasking, which helps the mystery aspect work well enough and makes for a fun rewatch. It's not entirely perfect. Some of the kills don't line up without some suspension of disbelief once the killer is revealed, and a core plot point about a movie marathon popular with basically every kid at the high school is among the most unbelievable things in the entire franchise. Seriously, the idea of the Stabathon, a party where people would watch all 7 of the Stab movies back to back, would get this much reception from a bunch of drunk teenagers is ridiculous. If the average Stab movie is as long as the average Scream movie, it would be about an hour 45 per flick. So 7 of those in a row, including a drinking game on top of it? Come on now. Even just showing one would be a stretch, since horror movies aren't that popular with the average person anyway. That's just a needless nitpick though, so let's get to something of a little more substance. The core cast is tight here, and after Scream 3 either botched or stagnated the characters of Sid, Gale, and Dewey, it's nice to see them written well again. On the other hand, the new cast isn't great. I mean, they're not bad or anything, but outside of Kirby, who's sort of a mixture of Randy and Tatum from the first Scream, and Ghostface once they're unmasked, none of the new blood are all that compelling. A lot of the side characters in this feel like they're just here to get iced, a slasher movie flaw which most of the Scream movies were pretty good at avoiding in the past. Speaking of characters getting iced though, Scream 4 doesn't skimp out on the violence and the horror this time around. Well, the movie isn't all that scary, being perfectly fair, no Scream is in my opinion. It has its moments, can be pretty gruesome at times, and it's nice to see a Scream movie have some teeth again. On that note, after a disappointing lack of them in 3, Roger L. Jackson is back with a vengeance as the voice of Ghostface this time around. Honestly, Jackson's work in Scream 4 might be his best overall in the series. His line delivery this time can go anywhere from smug to extremely caustic and pissed off effortlessly.
Are you writing this down?
Yes, I am. It's kind of hard to hear you. I'm in the hospital with Sydney. If you could just hang on 1 second.
I've got time. It's you that doesn't. You know, Rebecca, it doesn't sound to me like you're in the hospital. Sounds like you're in a parking garage. A dark and deserted parking garage.
And it adds menace back to the Ghostface presence again. On a less than stellar note relating to Ghosty, I have to admit there's an odd casting decision here. See, once unmasked, the Ghostface Killer's actor isn't any taller than 5'6". The stunt actor playing him in costume during every on-screen encounter, he's about 6'1". I know complaining about height is old hat, especially on the internet, but the clear visible difference when in costume and revealed is distracting. Granted, this is an absolute nitpick, and at the end of the day, I was actually pleasantly surprised while revisiting Scream 4. Despite a lot of issues I have with the presentation decisions, this is a solid enough slasher whodunit. Out of all the Scream sequels, in my opinion, 4 is head and shoulders the best one. Not exactly a ringing endorsement, but it's a pretty damn good movie and I would recommend it. You know the drill though. There's still more to cover in the spoiler section, so if I've convinced you to check out Scream 4 without too many details, skip to this part of the video to avoid them. I mentioned earlier how the occasional bloom did end up helping a scene, and the Perkins kill is the best example of it. The lights on the street all blending together in the bloom helps to create this dark contrast, and Ghostface standing behind him starts to look like this amorphous human-shaped blob with a white face over pure black mass. Sort of like No Face from Spirited Away, but he's got a knife on him. It's a great, striking visual. It's just a damn shame the whole movie used this kind of aggressive bloom rather than implementing it selectively. Earlier, I also spoke about how Scream 4 actually had a pretty tight script. And outside of that height nitpick between the revealed killers and the stunt actor, the build-up and unmasking of the two new Ghostface killers, Charlie and Jill, isn't actually bad. The idea of taking the stand-ins for Randy and Sid respectively this time around and turning them into the ones behind the entire thing is a pretty novel idea. Plus, since Scream 4 apparently didn't have the same kind of foundational rewrites of 2 and 3, the mystery here can have some proper foreshadowing and build up to the reveal. Here's a few instances I enjoyed. When the news of the latest Ghostface murders is sent out to every student at the high school, the only one in the class who we see doesn't check their phone is Jill, one of the two killers. Another one is how Jill gets a call from Ghostface when she's carpooling with two of her friends, and puts it on speaker so they can hear her being targeted. This sets up an alibi for Jill with witnesses. But notice how we don't see Charlie get the same. Of course not, because her plan is to turn on him in the end and pin him for the murders. The whole movie has nice little touches like that throughout. It's pretty good stuff. It's not all positive though. I said that the new cast isn't great, and I stand by that, which unfortunately includes one of the two new Ghostfaces. Charlie is honestly kind of lame. It's not like the actor's doing a bad job or anything, he's just not given too much to work with, even post-reveal. He's a nothing character before that, and still hardly has any screen presence during the typical Scream killer speech section. His best moment is when he kills Kirby, and has a hissy fit because she only started paying attention to him now. He looks so genuinely upset afterwards. It adds back that all too human weakness and pettiness, which Scream has lacked since the first movie, I'd argue. Jill herself is also kind of a nothing character before the big reveal, just a shallow copy of Sydney. At the risk of contradicting something I've repeated a few times about doing something poorly on purpose, not making it good, I actually think once the cat's out of the bag, this kind of adds to Jill's character. Jill's tied into the main ideas of Scream 4 more intimately, so we'll get back to her a little later. I also like the direction they took the core 3 for the most part, and it's nice that it actually feels like a decade has passed with their lives moving on. Sid trying to move out from the shadow of Ghostface is a nice continuation of what Scream 2 was doing with her character, and her taking a page out of Gale's book and writing one herself is a nice touch. On that note, it's interesting to see Gale play a different role here and be sort of the underdog this time around, with Sid and even Dewey being the big shots. The only one I'm not too sure about is Dewey, because while I do like that he's kind of made it and became the sheriff of Woodsboro, he's kind of an asshole here though. Gale's his wife, you think he of all people wouldn't be as demeaning and dismissive of her. And what happened to his nerve damage? He was limping with a shot arm in the last two movies, but here he's just walking around completely normal. All of this is just dancing around Scream 4's core theme, which ties the characters of Sid and Jill together, and also makes for an interesting continuation of the themes and ideas of the first Scream. Whereas the first movie was largely about how the idea of violent media causing the actions of violent people was ridiculous, this one is about how absurd the idea of those victimized by violence using it to garner fame exclusively is. I'll have to explain, and it all ties back to Jill and Charlie's motives. See, Jill and Charlie are planning to record the murders, make a big snuff film out of all the clips, and get famous by setting up Jill's ex as the fall guy, with them posing as the only survivors. As we know though, Jill's real plan is to set up Charlie as well, posing herself as the sole survivor. The largest reason why she did all this is simple. Jill's a psycho bitch, but her own rationale given is honestly pretty interesting. Basically, as a tertiary member of the Prescott family, Jill was raised hearing about Sydney and living in a well-off small town like Woodsboro, more than likely had to keep hearing about the only notable person from there. Only notable by virtue of her surviving the most notable thing to happen there. Basically, she doesn't see the tragedy of what happened to Sid. Again, psycho bitch, zero empathy. So the only thing that she can gather is that Sid became a minor celebrity because she was the target of multiple elaborate theatrical killing sprees and survived. It's as Jill puts it from her perspective, the only way to get famous these days is for fucked up shit to happen to you. Sid's arc in this movie plays well with this. Whereas she wants to move on from the tragic events of her past, numerous characters treat it as almost a commodity or something to be envious of. Jill obviously wants to be the new her, but don't forget Jill's mom, who seems to be openly jealous of Sid getting so much attention, even if she's passing it off as a joke. And then we have Sid's novel publicist, who's trying to push her to milk the role of the victim for as long as she can and as hard as she can, referring to anyone buying her story as inspirational as suckers. While Sid wants to live her own life and move on from her past, many of those around her express cynical opportunism and/or outright jealousy over her unwanted fame. If the original was about demystifying serial killers and other violent criminals, Scream 4 is about the callous way people in media often treat their victims. When victims come forward, how often do you hear sentiments like, "Why are they making it public? Why come out now?" or accusing them of just doing it all for attention. Sid's situation is contrasted with Jill's, who is essentially her polar opposite. Jill latches on to a tragic event and tries to milk it for every second of those 15 minutes of fame. After all, that's the only thing someone as truly shallow as Jill, or as sheltered from real-world violence and its impact like the publicist, would see from this. The fact that Jill is the direct cause of all this is just the cherry on top. Scream 4 continues the ideas of being sheltered from real-world violence from the first movie, but it's more cynical about it this time around, showing how callous that detachment from said violence can make people towards those victimized by it, and how fame really isn't the goal for them either. You know, these kind of ideas being explored ain't too bad for a movie about a guy in a monster mask stabbing a bunch of teenagers. There's more that I could get into, like some weirdly ahead of its time aspects in the movie, like the live streaming gimmick and how attention on social media has become such an obsession for the young. But smarter people than me can try to tackle that. As is, Scream 4 is a surprisingly solid movie, which managed to be both entertaining and decently thought-provoking. Of all the Scream sequels, this is definitely my favorite of them, and feels the most like a true follow-up to the core ideas of the original. Scream 4 was actually intended to be the start of a new trilogy, but this plan immediately ran into issues. The movie underperformed financially, and that was the biggest derailing factor, but Wes Craven himself only wanted to come back for a fifth movie that had a complete script that he approved of, and Kevin Williamson parted ways with Craven and his people as well. Paired with how Scream was then later adapted into a network television series, the movie franchise appeared to be on hiatus. The most tragic reason, however, was yet to come. On August 30th, 2015, Wes Craven died of a brain tumor at his Los Angeles home at the age of 76. He left behind a wife, 2 children, and a legendary filmmaking career. After the death of Scream's leading man and the fallout of the Harvey Weinstein scandal, the rights to the franchise went into limbo for a brief period, until eventually being picked up by Spyglass Media in 2019. Spyglass Media quickly put a fifth film into production. The movie-making team Radio Silence was tapped for directing duties. Matt Bettinelli-Olipin and Tyler Gillette, excuse the pronunciation, with production beginning in full force in September of 2020. Released in January 2022 and simply titled Scream, the movie would be the first in the series without Craven at the helm. So how does Scream 5 hold up? Oh, and just for the record, before I get into this movie is Scream 5, and I will be referring to it as such. I get the joke. The movie spells out the joke for the audience. It's still dumb. The opening kill scene honestly sums up my opinion of the movie as a whole. The scene looks nice, the performances are solid, the actual encounters with Ghostface are pretty kick-ass, and there's a lot of little details that you can pick up during a rewatch which are pretty clever. The individual pieces are here, but Scream 5 is much less than the sum of its parts. It's doing that annoying horror trend of loud musical stings to make the audience jump, and despite being well done overall, this is the closest the franchise has ever come to just straight up copying earlier installments. Even Scream 4, the movie kind of about remakes, didn't live in the shadow of the first movie quite as hard as Scream 5. If I had to briefly sum up Scream 5, I'd say that it's clearly a movie made by fans. For better, but sadly mostly for worse. It's a movie that's great with the little details, but completely botches the bigger picture. And while I still personally can get some enjoyment out of this movie, I would say it is the worst in the franchise next to only Scream 3. Oh boy, let's get into it. Scream 5 is riffing on the current trend of requels, as the movie puts it, and primarily focuses on a new cast of characters supported by the returning cast in a much more background role this time around. Unlike Scream 4 though, I generally do enjoy the new blood. The characters are all very stock and basic, but the actors are having a lot of fun with the material, and almost everyone tends to be enjoyable in their roles. Jenna Ortega is definitely the standout here, and between this and X, which came out around the same time, I'm beginning to warm up to her sort of like a 21st century Scream Queen. The only member of the cast I'm not sold on is the new lead, who plays Samantha. It's not like she's outright bad, but without getting into spoilers, she's given the absolute worst material to work with. We'll touch more on specifics later, but I don't think it helps her performance that she has to try and carry the single worst plot element in the entire franchise on her shoulders. I will say that I was surprised how little the core 3 are in Scream 5 when I first saw it. They're all still good, but Sid and Gale in particular really only play a prominent role in the climax. Really, it's Dewey who's easily the most front and center player of the three this time around. And this is the movie where the character gets to shine the most. He really isn't just played as pure comic relief this time around. And even though it's playing into the overdone, tired old man returning for one last ride trope really hard, David Arquette still plays his version of the character with the goofy goober charm of the past movies. Him doing the mandatory rules scene also feels right, and less like some Word of God sequence, how it felt in Scream 2 and 3, and more just like a sad old man reminiscing on the old days. That being said though, the script's quality peaks and valleys, with some truly baffling decisions made that really hurt the film. While Scream 5 does plant a lot of great little details along the way, it almost feels as if the writers were too concerned with those rather than making the big picture stuff like, the plot, the themes, the characters, all those things, the actual focus. Some extended sequences are also questionable inclusions. Most infamous, the door fake-out scene that's the horror equivalent of a Family Guy joke running itself into the ground. And without getting into the spoilers quite yet, the core twist of the movie as to why Samantha specifically is targeted by Ghostface is just awful. And full stop, and I can fully understand why this might ruin the movie for some people. What I can say is that it does tie into one of Scream 5's largest issues, just how self-referential it is to its own detriment. It feels the need to tie basically everything back to the first Scream and reference that movie constantly. Well, sometimes the callbacks work, after a while it begins to feel like retread and pandering. This is what I mean by saying this feels like a movie made by fans. They're so excited to be making a Scream movie that they're gleefully redoing all of their favorite beats from that movie, whether it makes their current movie better or not. And characters acknowledge how unoriginal a lot of this is in the movie itself, but honestly, that just makes it worse. All the Scream sequels have this problem to some degree, but Scream 5 might be the worst for doing this. Mocking something for being cliche, silly, or outright bad, and then doing it anyway. Thing is, people will point to that scene from the original movie where Sid makes fun of people not running out the front door in horror flicks, only for her to not run out the front door when Ghostface attacks, and argue that it's the same thing. I'd say there's a difference between that, which is more of a situational blink and you miss a gag, and what Scream 5 does, like have the climax of the film take place in Stu's house from the first movie, make a big deal out of it, only to have Sid point out how stupid and unoriginal it is.
You really need some new material.
I got you here, didn't I?
You might actually be the most derivative one of all. I mean, Christ, the same house.
One thing I did enjoy in Scream 5 was the use of Ghostface. Roger L. Jackson still has it, and this is tied with 4 for my favorite performance of his. He sounds like he's talking with a smug, shit-eating grin the entire time in this movie. It's a lot of fun. What I want to highlight more, though, is the actual Ghostface encounters themselves, because for the first time in the series, the kills themselves across the board are actually really entertaining. Every kill scene with the ghosty guy is well done, and the practical gore effects are probably the best in the series. While I'm not a fan of this movie on the whole, I will go on a limb and say this might have my favorite scene in any of the Scream movies. Thing is, Ghostface still takes some nasty licks in the movie, and none of the kills are ever extremely over the top to the point of absurdity. Ghostface is still vulnerable and grounded among the slashers, but Scream 5 still manages to make that vulnerability more menacing than ever. Overall, Scream 5 is a hard movie for me to review. I want to like it a lot more than I do, but overall, the piece just does not come together in the end. From how much it just loves living in the shadow of the original, all of the questionable to outright bad writing choices, and as we'll touch on in the spoiler section, how the third act completely tanks the movie overall, I'll say with confidence that Scream 5 is second only to 3 for the worst installment. Even then, I'm only putting Scream 3 below it because honestly, that movie just bored me. To really get into why Scream 5 doesn't work though, we'll have to get into spoilers. So if you want to judge the most recent movie in the series for yourself, this is the time to jump ship. If you want to hear the brief wrap up, jump to the time provided on screen, or just quit watching. We're at the end anyway. To go back to something I said not too long ago, my favorite scene in this movie, and maybe in any of the Scream flicks, has to be the Vince kill. In less than 2 minutes, it manages to do a lot, while also having a tasteful reference to the old movies with the return of the song Red Right Hand by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I haven't brought it up before, so may as well here. Red Right Hand is sort of a southern gothic rock song by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds for the album Let Love In. The song featured prominently in the first Scream movie, and afterward became part of the iconography of the original 3, with Scream 3 having a, admittedly less than stellar, cover version written for it. It also canonically appears in Stab 1, which the two Ghostface killers in Scream 5, Richie and Amber, are hyper-obsessive fans of. And what's the song one of them uses to lure Vince into a trap in the scene?
They'll reach deep into the hole, heal your shrinking soul, but there won't be a single thing that you can do. He's a god, he's a man, he's a ghost, he's a fool. And they're whispering his name through this disappearing rain, but didn't need his code.
It's an immediately unsettling situation, someone using your car for an ironic song choice and nowhere in sight, with the final punch of the scene being a mean-ass straight stab through the throat. With Vince failing to crawl away from a looming ghost face while quickly bleeding out, and the killer doing the iconic knife wipe all while the song reaches its climax, ooh, that's all good shit. And on the flip side, it works even better on a rewatch. Whoever it is under the hood, Richie or Amber there, both of them are huge dweebs for the first Stab movie, and they're trying to live it out in real life to inspire a new film. So, from the song choice to the knife wipe execution, this is essentially a massive nerd LARPing out their favorite movie. It's creepy, it's darkly funny, it's brief, it's perfect. So let's talk about what nearly killed Scream 5 for me. I mentioned how the actress for Samantha had to carry the single worst plot element in the entire Scream series on her shoulder. Well, that's cause while her legal name might be Samantha Carpenter, you really should call her Samantha Loomis. As in, Billy Loomis, one of the two original Ghostface killers and Samantha's biological father. Oh boy, you see what I mean by Scream 5 being too happy to shut out the original? And if that retcon wasn't bad enough, Scream 5 decides to make you ignore how ridiculous that kind of asshole plot point is by doing something even dumber. See, from the moment Samantha is introduced to the audience, we're shown that she's popping some kind of prescription pill. That's because she takes antipsychotics to avoid seeing the hallucination of Billy himself, played by a digitally de-aged returning Skeet Ulrich, in what amounts to one of the most bizarre cameos I've seen in a movie. Where do we even begin? Okay, I'm no doctor, but I can tell you this. Hallucinations do not work this way. They wouldn't be able to have such full detailed conversations like this, or be able to straight up point things out in the environment like the scene at the end with the knife. Plus, if Samantha really had schizophrenia like the movie seems to imply, the hallucinations wouldn't just be limited to seeing Billy like he's her own personal pyramid head stalking her or something. The script is clearly treating Billy like he's straight up a ghost. And if the figurative ghost of Maureen Prescott from Scream 3 was too much of a leap to just ripping off Friday the 13th, then what amounts to the literal ghost of Billy Loomis is a leap beyond even that. And by trying to respect the original, quote-unquote, and bring back Billy, it messes up at least why I thought the character worked in the first place. As said back in the Scream 1 review, Billy wasn't some super criminal genius or pure evil presence. Nah, he and Stu were fucking idiots. They were unremarkable, doing horrific things for petty and stupid reasons, and once the tables were turned on them, they both had full-on tantrums. The entire final act of the first Scream is about demystifying the Ghostface killer, and distinctly showing that the two of them are not a Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger type of supervillain. Scream 5 treats Billy like the exact thing the original tried to tear down, a boogeyman figure that everything ties back to. A lot of his dialogue with Samantha borders on glorifying him, weirdly enough, with some variations of saying, "You can't run from what you are," and "When are you gonna use it?" Use what? Serial killer juice? Is Billy just M. Bison with psycho energy now, and Samantha one of his dolls? Based on the ending of the movie, where Sam makes a new horror movie rule saying, "Don't fuck with a serial killer's daughter," before using mental illness as a weapon, I don't think this reading is too far off. I think I should go without saying, but serial killers aren't these mythological figures separate from humanity. Nah, they're usually inept screw-ups who kill for personal, petty, and stupid reasons, just like Billy and Stu were depicted. Maybe it's just me, but this is what really rubbed me the wrong way in Scream 5. How could they miss the point of the original this hard? It's not like Scream 1 is subtle about this or anything. The only explanation I can come up with is that they just didn't think about it. No. Billy's the main villain of Scream 1. Scream 1 is good, therefore Billy's the most important Ghostface ever. That's it. That was the line of thought. And then we get to the third act, and the entire movie just falls apart. Like we went over earlier, the plan of the two Ghostfaces, Richie and Amber, is to frame the daughter of the original Ghostface for a series of murders redoing the first movie, in order to inspire a brand new stab flick, since they're both huge dorks obsessed with the series. Honestly, this setup isn't that bad, and I will say it is kind of funny to think how Redditors were the loser main villains of two reboots of bigger name franchises released around the same time. That's pretty entertaining. Now, the real issue is that Scream 5 is so clearly trying to say something and have a deeper meaning with its villains, but by the end, maybe I'm just an idiot, but I honestly could not make heads or tails about whatever it's screaming about. Fans are bad? Online trolls who shit-talk big nerd culture movies, i.e. the one we're making, are loser sociopaths? The big final rant where they go over their motive is filled to the brim with buzzwords pulled straight from Kotaku op-eds about shitty online fan bases. How can fandom be toxic? Nobody takes the true fans seriously anymore. This time it's the fans who are gonna win, so on and so forth. And then there's the abundance of references to Rian Johnson, The Last Jedi, and online discourse about that movie. Can of fucking worms are opening right now. Now, for the record, I have no strong opinions on Rian Johnson, and I haven't seen any of the Disney Star Wars movies, not just limited to Last Jedi. However, I am familiar with how pissed off it made the perpetually pissed off Star Wars fanbase. As a no-life YouTube reviewer, I don't think I could have avoided it if I tried. You're still seeing multi-hour reviews, reactions, and frame-by-frame teardowns of Last Jedi. And before we tie this into whoever attempt Scream 5 makes it a main theme, I have to stress the movie absolutely is making reference to The Last Jedi and is doing so very often. I am not reading too far into this. It name drops Star Wars during the requel speech section and shortly references Rian Johnson by name after that. On top of that, Rian Johnson in-universe being the director of Stab 8, which fans hated because it was elevated horror. Hell, the only thing of Stab 8 we see is an angry YouTube reviewer trashing it while one of the Ghostface killers watches. It is admittedly a fun dead meat cameo, though. And get it? Stab 8, directed by Rian Johnson, like Star Wars 8, The Last Jedi, directed by Rian Johnson. If it was a one-off name drop, fine, but it's so frequent you cannot tell me this is not an intentional nod. Scream 5 is very clearly trying to say something about all of the toxic fan bases online that have gotten fairly big and vocal in the last decade or so. That much is obvious. Here's where it completely falls apart for me. You know what, let's throw Scream 5 a bone and run with its premise, just for an example. Online fandom is toxic, caustic, and hateful. Sure, got it. So what? The worst thing that you can get out of these kind of fans are overly long and trashy video essays like the one you're watching right now. Wow, so meta, I should write the next Scream movie! And I get why Last Jedi is their example, since that's probably the single most hate-watched and dissected piece of media made in the last decade or so, with those infamous multi-hour long rants online. The thing is, between that and being an asshole on social media, that is the extent of what shithead Star Wars nerds do while complaining about Last Jedi. So jumping from that to making the fanbase stand in straight up serial killers feels like one of the most extreme strawmen ever put on screen. Is Scream 5 really saying that fans are bad? I mean, I don't think so, since the new Randy stand-in Mindy isn't treated with this much scorn. Toxic fans and critics are bad? Sure, yeah, they're bad, but can you find me real examples of real-world violence and murder stemming from someone making a shitty 8-hour essay about how much Last Jedi sucked? And I distinctly remember a certain horror movie about a masked killer where the main take-home idea was how absurd criminals blaming media for their violent crimes was. Scream 5 has no real message or theme. It's just loud, incoherent rambling about topical things that it blows way out of proportion. It has about as much nuance as a Law & Order SVU episode, and you don't even get to stare at Christopher Maloney's huge ass this time around. Maybe I'm too biased since I'm a shitty, toxic internet reviewer myself, but it's kind of laughable to see Scream 5 try to portray fans like this as dangerous. Scream 5 isn't the worst in the series, I stand by that, and the director duo behind it does know how to make a well-shot slasher flick, but they really need to get a tight script worth filming next time, since they're doing the inevitable Scream 6. Scream 5 is a total mess, and each time I reflect on it, it gets a little worse. And that's the Scream franchise. I have a lot of nostalgia for the series, and it was interesting to go through all of them with a more critical eye. For ranking them, I referred to my order through the video, but for a lightning quick sum up, from best to worst, I'd say it's Scream 1, 4, 2, 5, and 3 dead last. Despite all the issues I had with Scream 5, it did entertain me, as a lot of things I do genuinely like about it, and it never was boring like Scream 3. This is being written and edited during the production of Scream 6, so while I'm cautiously interested in that one, there's clear red flags I'm seeing with it already. First off, releasing just slightly over a year after the 2022 movie seems a bit fast. And with Neve Campbell not coming back for the first time in the franchise over what seems like a pay dispute, I'm getting the feeling Scream 6 might be made quick, cheap, and dirty. Regardless of how that movie turns out, the original Scream will remain an all-time classic in the horror genre that became instantly iconic by asking the audience a simple question. What's your favorite scary movie? Jesus Christ, the worst ghost face ever.